In a December op-ed for Teen Vogue, legal aid public defender and political commentator Olayemi Olurin argues that cop shows like Law and Order have helped convince Americans that there is only one answer to crime: more policing. She writes, "We're taught to fear and dislike the people caught in the crossfires of the criminal legal system rather than to fear the system that inflicts pain on them. We are taught there are bad people who were just born bad, who do bad things, and that the only way to keep the good people safe is for police to do whatever they can to lock the bad people away."
Olayemi is here to expand. Glad to have you back with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Morning, everybody.
Yeah, so this is actually a topic that I agree with you a lot on, and I'm also I don't know what the right word, concerned feels like the wrong word, but exercised about how Law and Order promotes very negative or unhealthy or socially undesirable ideas about criminal justice and policing. So why don't you give us the thesis of what you wrote?
So basically, I wrote this piece because I wanted to show people that I think we're actually more aligned than we think across political spectrum when it comes to our underlying beliefs of the criminal system. I think, unfortunately, when we have conversations about criminal justice reform, it normally gets framed as though it's this progressives versus conservatives fight, or that the number one impediment to criminal justice reform is the right. But if you look at places like New York City, that's considered a Democratic stronghold, we have a Democrat in the mayor's office, in the governor's office, and every DA's office. We have all of the same, injustices or things that shock the conscience that are talked about on the right. So I wanted to show people, well, what are these underlying factors uniting us, and how do we all similarly see people? And I think what happens is, there's certain outrage that happens when you hear about Rikers or a humanitarian crisis or the occasional injustice. But when you actually look at the day-to-day, progressives and Republicans alike are all tend to be similarly feeling. And I think that comes from shows not just like Law and Order, but Law and Order, Snap, to Blue Bloods, Lucifer. It's tons of them. And so that's what I really wanted to hone in on.
Yeah, there's a lot of, in cop shows in general, actually Law and Order probably isn't the worst offender on this front, but in kind of our police procedurals, our new interest in serial killer podcasts and all that stuff, I think this idea, or gives people the impression that there are a lot of random kidnappings on the street, that kind of things, when sexual abuse, kidnapping, abuse of minors is, in the vast majority of cases, the responsible party is someone known to the victim, a family member. It's a lot of, there's custody disputes. The kind of, white van pulls up, grabs you or your child off the street, and you never see them again, is something that happens in 1 in a million cases. But that's not the impression you get from these cop shows.
Exactly. It creates this kind of mass hysteria.
Yeah. Another thing that I think kind of plays into this a little bit is the cultural divide in America. I've lived all around the country: Idaho, Utah, California, New York, Illinois, Indiana, Texas. I've lived everywhere. And I can tell you that, red areas, Republican-run areas, where I think a lot of them might have this mentality that you're sort of talking about, where it's inherent, people are taught the bad people are the ones that the police are going after. But I will say, I grew up in Boise, Idaho. I never saw cops on the streets. We just don't see them, right? They're not patrolling the streets. They're not walking around. Cops are really only for those few instances where trouble arises, right? Where I live in Los Angeles now, cops are all over the streets. I see them every day, walking the streets, patrolling around. And so I think in a lot of these red areas with these red voters, they're not in the big cities as much. They tend to be more in the rural areas where they're not seeing cops. So in their mind, cops are only there when bad things happen for bad people, whereas people that live in the cities that tend to be more democratic, more progressive, are encountering cops a lot more often, and that is breeding a different kind of dynamic between the people and the police forces.
I think that's 100%
Do you think that plays into it?
Yeah, I think that's very much so true. The people that deal with deal with policing a lot have a different experience with police presence, right? People that are normally in support of more cops, more favorable funding, and seeing this higher police presence don't live with them. They're not the ones being policed as much. Like you say this, I live in Brooklyn, so I walk outside right now, I see a police bus station, right? I see police 24/7. You go in the train stations. So I think you're absolutely right. And it comes to having to listen to those people that are actually engaging with them. But I think this is an important reality. Even people that, oppose the criminal system, or people that, are interacting with the police and know that there's problems with over-policing, still have a tendency to lean towards feeling like they're a necessity or they have to be so extremely funded because that's the only world that they know. They're only told that you need police. Police are how we deal with things. That's the response. So I think we're seeing it across both aisles.
Yeah, and there's a debate going on within the criminal justice movement now that I'd like to get your take on. Basically, with criminal justice reform has been a slog for a very long time. Picked up momentum around Ferguson, and more recently in the wake of the George Floyd protests. You then saw this stall out in Congress, and you're starting to see a reaction, a similar way you saw kind of a backlash in the 70s and 80s, and now there's a debate going on about how or if to respond to that and change strategy or change rhetoric in order to prevent the backlash from wiping away all of the gains and prevent the movement from continuing to move forward, because the gains that it has made are few and are small. So what's your take on how the movement needs to think about this new backlash that's going on?
I think there's always going to be backlash to everything, especially when it comes to, opposing or resisting a criminal justice system or a legal system that has existed, right? It doesn't become a pervasive problem or exist as an everyday part of our society because people don't agree with it or because it's not in the majority. So I think we have to expect that abolition, criminal justice reform, wherever you fall on the spectrum for political change, there's going to be some kind of resistance. And I don't think we should get discouraged, right? In the last year or two, we've seen a huge rise in just even what we're talking about on a public level, right? Just having this op-ed and talking to y'all about it. This isn't that revolutionary of an idea for me, and people like me that exist in the space that have studied this. This is long talked about, but you're not seeing it as much in the mainstream, but we're seeing it now. So I wouldn't get discouraged.
Olayemi, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you to Frieza, Goku, and Piccolo in the background, I believe, from Dragon Ball Z.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye. And stick with us. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.